Chapter 22. When Eiji returned from making his dinner deliveries, he found the kitchens in a very strange state. Everyone was sitting and eating their own meals in a little cluster, and all around the rest of the room, a shape was moving so quickly his eyes couldn't quite follow it. "I told you it wouldn't all be done in time, my lord," Zenji drawled when he saw Eiji. "This man is quick. Young legs are a wonder." Young as they might have been, Eji's legs felt awfully slow in comparison with the blur. He realized that the speeding figure was Lord Felix only as the god rushed up to him and reached for his cart. "Hello, Eiji," his master said. Eiji had never heard Lord Felix's voice quite like this. He sounded disheveled. Could someone sound disheveled? He certainly looked the part. His hair was a mess, and his sleeves were pushed carelessly up over his elbows. It was also strange and unexpected that when the god reached for his cart, Eiji relinquished it without even remembering to return his greeting or make a bow. "Thank you," Lord Felix beamed as he took the cart. "I'll only be a moment." He zoomed away again, not as quickly as before, but still fast enough to make the cart's wheels squeal in protest, and some of the dirty lunch dishes Eiji had collected rattled dangerously. The god sped to a sink and began... His hands were moving so quickly it was hard to follow the motions, but he seemed to be washing the dishes. "Eiji." It didn't sound like this was the first time Rokuro had called his name. "I've got your supper here." Eiji joined the little cluster and knelt beside Norio, half convinced he was in a dream. The baker reached across Norio to give Eiji his plate, which made Norio blush a little even as he turned his head to speak to Eiji. "You'd better stay with us," Norio advised. "He's liable to run over anybody who gets in his way." "I will not," the god hollered from the sink, where a third of the dishes were already gleaming in their stack. "You can all sit anywhere you want. You don't have to huddle up like that." Norio snorted. "I'm not taking the chance, my lord. I like having all my limbs." Eiji took a few bites of his food in dazed silence before he decided that this was not, in fact, a dream. The food tasted too real for that. "Why is my lord doing the dishes?" he asked at last, his voice perfectly calm and even. "Not just the dishes." Zenji popped a cube of yam into his mouth, chewed, swallowed, and then resumed. "He's doing everyone's chores so he can get us all out of here early. He seems very set on having a private lesson." The last sentence was accompanied by a smirk. Norio hooted and elbowed Eiji in the ribs, and Eiji, for his part, wished he could sink through the floor. There was no way Lord Felix's supernatural hearing had missed any of that, though the only sign that he'd heard was an even more frantic pace in his dishwashing. "Good thing, too," Rokuro said with a glower. He pointed first at Norio, then at Zenji. "I taught Eiji all my tricks, and I agreed that he could show Lord Felix, but I don't want the rest of you rabble knowing my secrets. You'll use the knowledge to topple me and take my place as head baker." Norio pouted. "And Eiji won't?" "I am grooming Eiji to be my successor." Rokuro gestured at Eiji with his fork. "When he betrays me, I will know that his training is complete." The men wandered off one by one as they finished their meals. Yudai gave Eiji a significant look that reminded him of what he'd said the night of the disastrous party about being gentle with Lord Felix, whatever that meant. Rokuro's look was much warmer and more encouraging, and Norio just waggled his eyebrows suggestively before rushing to catch up with the baker. Each of them handed over their plates to Lord Felix, who accepted each with a cheery, "Thank you," and kept right on washing. In a gesture of true mercy, Rokuro had taken Eji's dishes along with his own. Eiji didn't think he was physically capable of handing his plate to a god for washing. The kitchens emptied until only Zenji remained. Eiji was grateful for that. He couldn't imagine being the only person left to sit and stare while his master worked at these menial tasks. Zenji seemed much less troubled by the situation. When the last of the others were gone, he leaned against the wall with his arms folded over his ample middle and stared at Lord Felix, who had moved on to drawing by this time. "You're making me nervous," the god whined after a minute of this. "I feel like you're just waiting for me to make a mistake so you can swoop down on me." Zenji smirked. "That's exactly what I'm doing. I agreed to this as long as you did the job right." "I am," Lord Felix protested. "I may not know how to cook very well, but I'm fantastic at cleaning. You know that." The older man shook his head and tutted. "That's why I have to watch you. When you get cocky like that, that's when you make mistakes." There it was again, teasing, friendly banter. Gods, they were all so good at it. Eiji was so dazed by everything going on that he couldn't even muster up any envy of the skill. Instead, he just listened and admired them, so quick and clever, so comfortable with each other. It took an eternity for Lord Felix to finish putting the dishes away and mopping up all the water his high-speed washing had splashed over the tables and floor, though Eiji knew that realistically it couldn't have been more than a quarter hour. Finally, the god stood in front of Zenji, trying, and mostly failing, to manhandle his collar into its usual crisp fold. "Well," Lord Felix asked hopefully, "do I pass muster?" Zenji smiled. "Of course, you're fantastic at cleaning. Now, remember, I expect it to look just as good when I come back tomorrow. No stray flour." "Not a single particle," Lord Felix swore, hand on his heart. "Good." The older man nodded. "Well then, I'm off. You two have fun." Eiji was ridiculous. He'd spent most of the last few days, as he recovered from his injury, alone with Lord Felix. He lived with Lord Felix. They spent time alone together every day. And yet, as Eiji left, Eiji had a sudden urge to beg the man to stay. This was all so strange. He had no reason to think that anything bad would happen, but some part of his mind couldn't stop screaming that anyone who would go to such efforts just to spend time with him was dangerous. His discomfort must have been obvious, because when he turned his head back to face Lord Felix, the god looked a little abashed. "It's perfectly all right if you don't feel like doing this anymore," he said, patting a little more frantically at his clothes and hair. "I'm sure I look a mess, and you've just had a full day. I won't be disappointed if you'd rather just go home." That had to be a lie. Lord Felix had been charging around like a sandstorm, and he'd practically vibrated with enthusiasm when he saw Eiji. Still, his gaze and voice were perfectly level, as if he would truly be content with any decision his attendant made. Eiji scolded himself for his foolishness. There was nothing dangerous about this. In fact, it was an unprecedented opportunity to please a master who asked so little of him. He needed to stop panicking over nothing and try to enjoy this. "Not at all, my lord," he said, and his smile was genuine. Lord Felix, for his part, beamed back at him. "If you're sure." "Yes, my lord, it would be your servant's honor to—" "Teach you" sounded terribly presumptuous, but how else could he word it? "To reveal all of Rokuro's precious secrets," the god supplied, coming to his rescue. "Come on, then. You can't commit baking espionage if you're kneeling here." After 2 weeks with Lord Felix, Eiji wasn't startled when his master extended a hand to help him up. In fact, he rather enjoyed the contact. Lord Felix's hands were rough and calloused, and the faint scraping made a thrilling contrast with Eiji's own soft palms. His master led him to Rokuro's station, which the baker had considerately left ready for them. Lord Felix stopped, and Eiji darted a glance up to find the god's eyes wide as he stared down at all the ingredients laid out in a neat row. "Goodness," Lord Felix breathed. "No wonder the bread here always looks so fine." My lord?" Eiji didn't quite dare to ask, "What in the world do you mean?" but his stammering seemed to be clear enough for Lord Felix. "I never knew bread could have so many ingredients," the god explained. "What do we do first?" Eiji gave up on getting any further answers at the moment. "We warm some water, my lord." Lord Felix perked up even more. "Oh, good! I'll get the kettle, and we can make tea with the water that's left." The god stoked the embers of Rokuro's big oven and filled a kettle. Eiji had never seen Rokuro do it this way, but then he'd only made such small portions of bread when he was teaching Eiji. Why wouldn't water from a kettle work just as well? "We can't let it boil," he said as Lord Felix settled the pot. "It just needs to be warm." "All right." The god smiled at him. "What do we do in the meantime?" Eiji smiled back and felt his shoulders relax just a little bit. "We'll mix up the sugar and yeast in the trencher. Rokuro said he would leave us a little one." "Oh, right here!" Plucking up the shallow dish, Lord Felix cast a glance at the baker's usual trencher. "That thing is huge! No wonder Rokuro's built like a boulder." Lord Felix's build was not much different from Rokuro's. In fact, he was even bigger and broader than the baker. Eiji could easily imagine his master handling the great trencher of dough the way the baker did, his shoulders rolling and biceps straining with the rhythmic motions of kneading, his strong, capable fingers working the dough with every movement. Yes, he could imagine that all too easily. "Here's the sugar," the god continued, breaking Eiji out of his thoughts. "And you said we need yeast? What's that?" "Here." Eiji reached for the jar and, realizing suddenly how long it had been since he'd used an honorific, added a hasty, "My lord?" Lord Felix peered into the jar. "That looks so strange. What is it?" "I don't quite know," Eiji admitted. "Please forgive your servant's ignorance." "Sweetheart, you know what it's called, so you're already less ignorant than me. How much do we add?" It was surprisingly easy to work with his master like this. Eiji didn't have to worry about whether he was making good conversation, because talk flowed easily from what they were doing and Lord Felix's questions about it. He didn't have to worry about his position, because they were both busy and moving. He didn't have to worry about being pleasing or finding a way to be of service, because the entire endeavor was happening at Lord Felix's request. He didn't have to worry about anything. It was also a pleasant surprise to find how compatible their styles of work were. Eiji had always been single-minded about tasks, and he was grateful, if a little confused, to find that the god also approached the humble work seriously. He didn't joke or get distracted, though his demeanor stayed friendly and smiling. He treated each step of making bread he couldn't eat as though it deserved his whole focus. "This is so fine," Lord Felix marveled as they measured the flour out of a huge barrel. "Look at that! And so white! It must have been ground 6 times." Eiji couldn't help smiling a little at his wide eyes. He ought to be surprised that a legendary war god would be so awestruck at the quality of some flour, but honestly, it seemed like the sort of thing Lord Felix would get excited about. Something soft and warm filled him as he watched the god take a pinch of flour and rub it between his fingers with further exclamations of delight, and it was a little difficult to return his attention to the task at hand. "We'll add the salt and herbs to it, then put it in the trencher with the yeast mixture," he said, at which Lord Felix's eyes widened even more. "May I knead it?" he asked, sounding like a child at the temple begging to be allowed to pull the rope and ring the evening bell. "My lord may do as he wishes," Eiji replied, wrestling down another surge of that warm feeling. The god's enthusiasm didn't flag when they poured the bowl of dry ingredients into the trencher, but he did hesitate, ducking his head and peering at Eiji through his lashes. "It's been a long time since I kneaded dough," he said. "I'd be terribly grateful if you would remind me how to do it. You could just put your hands over mine and I would mimic your movements." Eiji froze. As soon as he heard his master's suggestion, he found himself paralyzed with a sudden realization. He wanted to do that. gods, he wanted so badly to stand that close to Lord Felix, to press those big, powerful, gentle hands under his own, to lean into his body and savor every tiniest point of contact. He wanted it in a great, overpowering rush that rooted him to his spot. Surely he wasn't allowed to want something this much. There had to be something wrong with it, with him for wanting it, with something. It couldn't be safe to just do a thing that he wanted so badly to do. There must be impropriety somewhere in the desire, arrogance or presumption or... The god's eyes widened just a little as Eiji hesitated. He straightened and held his hands out placatingly. Sorry, Eiji. That wasn't in order. You don't have to. I'm sure I'll do just fine. It's only kneading, after all. Lists and rules all battered at Eiji's mind, but he forced them down and, with a sudden desperate resolution he hadn't known he'd possessed, he marched forward. It would be my pleasure, my lord, he said firmly. Lord Felix shot him a look of surprise, but he didn't protest as Eiji moved into place. That was good. At the slightest bit of resistance, Eiji was fairly sure that his bravado would dissolve and he'd start hyperventilating. He squeezed next to the god, so close that he could feel the faint chill of his skin through his clothes, and reached across his chest to press both their hands into the dough. Like this, Eiji said, and if his voice cracked a little, his master didn't comment on it. I am not doing anything wrong, he told himself fiercely. This is what my master wants. It doesn't somehow become the wrong thing just because I want it to. Why shouldn't I be excited to obey? It's what I'm for. Eiji might have known what he was for, but he still wasn't entirely sure what all this was for. It felt like flirtation, but surely the god knew he didn't have to flirt with Eiji. If he wanted him, all he had to do was take him. No matter how many insinuations Zenji or Norio made, that remained the reality of the situation. So, since Lord Felix hadn't taken him yet, it meant he didn't want him. Still, they were pressed so close together, and oh gods, the feeling of Lord Felix's hips pressing into his and his hands under Eiji's in all this ridiculous dough. And really, there was no way the god had forgotten how to knead. It wasn't exactly an elaborate process. Amazing, Lord Felix breathed. It feels even finer like this. Eating this bread must be like biting into clouds. Then he laughed, and the always shocking volume of his laughter did not entirely explain the thrill that ran down Eiji's spine. The sensation of being close enough to feel as well as hear it might have had more to do with his excitement. Oh dear, talking about biting clouds, Lord Felix chuckled. You must think I'm fixated, that I wander about all day just surveying the world to find things I'd like to bite. Not at all, my lord. But now Eiji was thinking about the last time he'd been something Lord Felix liked to bite, about the feeling of his arm around Eiji's shoulders and his lips against Eiji's throat. And it wasn't a very good idea to think about these sorts of things when Eiji was standing this close and certain reactions might be more noticeable than usual. How do we know when it's been needed enough? Lord Felix asked, and Eiji was overwhelmed with gratitude to be talking about the bread again. Gods, he was a wreck, and if he didn't know better, he'd think he was enjoying it.